Hi, everyone, and welcome to Psych 3530, where in this lecture, we're going to talk about two major things. First, how to read journal articles, and more specifically, the makeup of a journal article, the different sections, what each section does, why we have it, the best way to approach each of those different sections. How the and the second major class of thing we're going to talk about today is APA style, both APA style in general, like why we have it and how that relates to the structure of journal articles, and then a little bit of nitty gritty about the details of APA style, in text citations, reference section citations, and writing style, the way and manner in which you should write. So let's get to it. We'll start with some just basic generalities about APA style. What is it? So, APA style is a professional style of writing, much like MLA or Chicago, which are the other big ones. MLA is typically seen in English. Chicago is typically seen in history. And then more or less everything else is APA style. Even though APA stands for the American Psychological Association, biology uses APA style, chemistry uses APA style, physics uses APA style, medicine generally uses APA style. Basically, almost all of the sciences use APA style, with perhaps some individual tweaks depending on the specific necessities of that discipline. So it's a style of writing, but what we have to understand about APA style is that it's for the sciences, which means it's all about the preparation of a manuscript for publication. APA style and its core is all about doing science and then writing up that science in order for it to be published and communicated to other people. And as we've talked about some this semester, science communication is very regimented, right? It's very specific about what it wants, because that specificity and those rules are going to help us most effectively and efficiently communicate our information to the public. MLA is about writing beautifully, right? And it's also about communicating, but communicating in a medium where the way you sound aesthetically should be pleasing, right? And you're talking about and discussing and quoting writing that might be attempting to be aesthetically pleasing. So we can think of MLA as having rules and guidelines, but MLA is much more flexible and allows for a lot more sort of freedom than does APA style. So APA tells us what we should write about, the content of a manuscript, as well as how it should be organized. This is going to be very important when we discuss how to read these manuscripts. It tells us about writing style, the type of words you should use, active versus passive voice, when and how and if you should ever use quotations, those sorts of grammar style issues. It, of course, covers how you should reference other people's work, and then specifically how to prepare that manuscript for publication. And so what we're going to see, and what we're going to spend a decent amount of time with, is that APA style breaks papers up into sections, and each section has a very specific focus and a very specific goal in mind for communicating to the reader. Each section is going to convey very specific information and very different information from all of the other sections. And so one advantage to this sort of section breakup is, for example, if I'm reading a paper and it's possible that I don't really even care about the topic that the paper is written about, but I'm really interested in this new statistic that they're using, or I'm really interested in evaluating the way that they use statistics, or I'm really interested in evaluating a measurement tool that they used. Right? I don't care about their hypothesis. I don't care about the outcome. I care something about their methods or their statistics. I can just go to that section and get the information I need, rather than having to sort of plow through this giant paper that I might only care about 5% of it. Right? So this dividing the paper up into sections can be really advantageous and time saving. Again, this is kind of what a little summary of what I just talked about. That APA style is probably a bit unlike other forms of writing that you've had in the past. MLA and to some extent Chicago encourage creativity and variation. APA style is much more formulaic. It's much more rigid. It's much more strict and scientific. A couple important details. APA style wants to use active voice, not passive voice. It's very easy to fall into passive voice. And in fact, we speak in passive voice much of the time. But when we write in APA style, we want to use active voice. If you're unsure about the difference between these two things, don't worry, we're going to get there later. And then APA style focuses on research, the topics at hand. It focuses on the ideas, not the people, not the researchers. So if you were writing an MLA style paper about some Shakespeare play, it would be probably encouraged and would be very relevant to include details about Shakespeare's life that might have led him to write a particular play, right? So it's believed that while Shakespeare was writing The Taming of the Shrew, he was going through a particularly bad time in his marriage or his relationship with his family. And so we might see those elements woven throughout in Taming of the Shrew, right? It's relevant and encouraged to bring up those details about the person. In APA style, to the contrary, we don't care about the people pretty much ever at all. Very few specific circumstances where you might want to mention and talk about individuals themselves. But 99% of the time, we don't care about the researcher. We care about the research. We care about the ideas, the topics, the findings. That's going to be our focus. We're going to basically completely avoid talking about people, individuals, authors. We're only going to talk about the topics at hand. A big issue in APA style is the use of quotations. I would say that you should never use quotations in APA style. Now, that's not strictly true. Obviously, there is APA style for how to appropriately quote someone in instances where you must. And there are situations where you might want to specifically quote someone if those specific words are a focus of discussion or a topic. But in general, when you write an APA style, you want to be writing in your own words. You do not want to be quoting other people. You want to be summarizing what someone else has found in your own words and then citing their original finding, their paper. So whereas in MLA, you cite quotations, right? When you quote someone else, that's when you put a citation generally. In APA style, we don't cite quotes because we don't want, well, we do cite quotes, but we don't want to use quotations generally at all because we want to be citing ideas, right? Remember, we're not focused on the exact words or the person. We're focused on the ideas behind those words and that person. So we discuss topics, we discuss findings, we discuss theories, and then we cite the original source of that material, even though we are not using their exact words. So what APA style focuses on here, this third point, is the integration of your ideas with those previous findings. That's really what we want to focus on is, can you take all this previous work and sort of bend it and mold it and shape it to form the idea that you want to be forming. So we generally do not use quotations. You can write a full manuscript that could be 20, 30, 40 pages, and it would be quite appropriate to not have a single quotation in that 30 or 40 page manuscript. Okay, so when we're approaching a published scientific paper, the paper generally actually follows the scientific method itself in its organization. So First, we want to bring up what the topic is and why it's important. That's going to fall in what we call the introduction section. Right? What are we talking about and why do we care? Next, what is the specific problem or question that we are trying to solve or question that we're asking, right? So this first point is more general. What's the topic? Why is it important? What previous research has happened? And then we get more specific. What is the current problem at hand? What is the current question that I, the researcher, am asking? Then we move on to what's called the method section, which is what I like to call the recipe for your experiment. What did you do to try and solve the problem or answer the question? So our method section is our second major section, and we're talking about what we did. Next, we have the results section, which is show me your data. What did you find? And lastly, the discussion section, which is your interpretation of your findings. What do they mean? Why are your findings important? How do they fit with the literature? Do your findings necessitate a change in a theory, a change in the way we think about something? Do your findings necessitate future research, as hopefully they do, right? What we've answered this question. Now, what new questions do we have, or what new areas can we expand this research to? The first thing you're going to see when you encounter a journal article is the title page. Now, the title page is going to look a little different based upon the specific journal of publication, but the title page is going to give you the title of the paper along with generally the name of the journal, the authors of this specific paper, their academic affiliations, and this title is going to give you a very general idea about what the article is about and the question it's asking. And a simple, again, APA style loves formulas. A simple formula for writing a title is including and making sure to include what's the primary independent variable and what's the primary dependent variable. So, for example, autistic children's aggression responses when compared to non-autistic children. So our independent variable here is the presence of an autism diagnosis, and our dependent variable is aggression responses. Right? I immediately have those two pieces of information. I don't know exactly how they have defined autism, right? I don't know how they quantified autism. I don't know exactly what they mean by aggression response. I don't know how they quantified it, but I know that those are going to be our two major independent and dependent variables just from the title itself. The other major thing you're going to see on the title page is called the abstract. An abstract is a short-ish paragraph, usually no more than 5-6 sentences, that summarizes the main points of the entire article. It's going to devote maybe a sentence or two to the introduction, a sentence or two to the methods, a sentence or two to the results, a sentence or two to the discussion section. Now, abstracts just might be the most important part of a journal article when you're learning how to read them, because this abstract is your key to not wasting your time. It might take you a minute or two to read an abstract, and that abstract is going to essentially inform you in very brief sort of points about the entire paper itself, about the entire study. So let's imagine that I'm interested in autism, but I'm not interested in aggression in autism. I'm interested in like social behavior and autism. And so somehow I stumbled upon this paper, Autistic Children's Aggression Responses when compared to non-autistic children. And I want to know, okay, I mean, I'm not really interested in aggression, but do they have any social component? Is this maybe social aggression? And in which case I might be interested in this paper. Instead of having to read the entire paper, 20, 30 pages, and take potentially an hour or two of my time, I can read the abstract, this paragraph, and my reading of this abstract can inform me about whether I need to go read the whole paper. Right? It's a little cheat sheet. It's like think of an abstract as crib notes, right? It's your crib notes to the entire article. And if you read the abstract and you go, that's not quite in the ballpark of my topic or what I'm looking for or what I need, then you just move on and you didn't waste any more than a minute or two of your time. But if you read the abstract and then you go, ooh, that sounds like exactly the type of article I need to read, or ooh, that sounds like a really interesting measurement tool potentially, I think I should read this article. Now you can invest the time in reading this particular article, having some degree of confidence that it will actually be worth your time and that you're not just wasting your efforts on reading an irrelevant article. So abstracts are incredibly important, especially at this early stage when you're just learning about a topic and when you're learning how to read journal articles. Okay, so let's talk about our first major section of the text of the article itself. We call this the introduction section. And you can think of this section as a big lit review that then finishes with our hypothesis for this specific study. Because remember, someone who's writing an APA style paper is a scientist who has done an experiment and wants to publish that experiment. So the core of what they're interested in conveying is their experiment, their methods, and their results. However, we have to place my current experiment in the context of the broader literature. And placing my experiment in the context of the broader literature is the purpose of the introduction. So the introduction specifies the topic and the problem to be studied. It talks about why it's important. It discusses previous research related to this problem. So what do we already know, right? In the last 40 years, what do we already know about autism and aggression, right? Because we don't just randomly choose experiments and topics to conduct. We choose experiments and topics in such a way that we advance science. We don't want to just be repeating something we already know. We want to go back and look at what is already understood, what is already known, and then move forward from there. So we need to discuss this previous research and literature. So imagine if you were a physicist and you're interested in something about the gravitational pull of Mars, right? You don't have to go all the way back to like what is gravity, right? You don't have to re-find gravity in order to study the gravitational orbit and pull of Mars, because it's already previously been done. Someone has already figured out gravity. So let's talk about that and say, hey, these people a while ago already figured out all this previous stuff. And so we're going to pick up from X point, right? And move forward. And lastly, introduction sections generally end in my specific hypothesis, my specific prediction for this current experiment, and my rationale. Why is that my hypothesis? So a hypothesis is how I think my independent variable is going to impact my dependent variable. So perhaps autistic children will display higher amounts of social aggression than non-autistic children, right? So what do I think my IV is going to do to my DV? That's a hypothesis. A rationale is the theoretical reasoning for why I chose that particular hypothesis. I could have said that autistic children and non-autistic children will be equal. I could have said that autistic children will be less aggressive than non-autistic children, but I didn't. I said that autistic children will have more aggression than non-autistic children. Why? Why is that my choice? Well, that's the rationale. That's all this previous research that has led me to this hypothesis, and thus I need to explain how I got from point A to point B using my rationale. We can think of the introduction section as an inverted triangle. So what that means is that it starts much more general, right? What's the question at hand? What's the topic? What do we already know? And as we move along in the introduction, our focus tightens and tightens and tightens and tightens until we get right here to the point of the triangle, which is my experiment, right? What was my hypothesis and what did I do? So this body of the triangle is funneling me to my experiment. We're starting broadly, right? We have to explain to our reader, okay, what's the topic? Why is it important? What question are we asking? What have we already found? What do we already know? Are there competing theories? Is there conflicting research? And here's what we're going to do. So we start general and we slowly move more specific in our introduction. And remember, this is all scientific information. This is not just like, I find autism very interesting and it makes me sad that some people have autism. And so I want to understand about their aggression. That's not what we're talking about here. Science doesn't care about your personal feelings. We care about what are you basing your hypothesis and rationale on? What is the relevant previous research? How can it inform new questions? And what did you do scientifically, not personally? So things that the introduction does and some things that the introduction doesn't do. It does describe the main findings, methodological issues, and conclusions of previous research in the relevant area. So we're going to start with a general discussion about what do we know about autism in general? What do we know about aggression in general? What do we know about the connection between autism and aggression, right? We're going to talk about this previous research, but it doesn't provide a ton of detail about the exact procedures of those other studies. We're not so concerned about their exact procedures. If someone is, they're free to go find that paper and read about their procedures. We're more concerned with their findings and their conclusions of the previous research. It does include details about the methodology and potentially procedures, but only when it's relevant to our current study, meaning maybe in the past, someone created what we feel like is a flawed or inappropriate measurement tool. Maybe the purpose of our study is to correct this mistake in methodology. And in that case, it would be relevant to go into some details about methodology in addition to the main findings and conclusions. The introduction uses APA style, particularly for in-text citations. And of course, we need proper grammar and spelling. And when we put these things together, APA style and grammar and spelling, what that comes out to is that an introduction does not sound like the way that you speak to your friends and family. When I write papers to publish, they don't sound like me. They sound like the scientist version of me, right? I don't talk to my friends the same way that I write, and neither should you. You should work on flipping a switch where you flip the switch on and you become this very scientific, professional sounding writer. And then you're free to flip the switch off when you go back to normal life. But your academic writing should not read the way you speak. So your language should be formalized. It should be clear, concise, direct. It should not be meandering. It should not be colloquial, meaning informal. You shouldn't use slang or things like contractions very often. So we want to keep that in mind as we're both reading and writing scientifically. Our next major section is the method section. And like I said earlier, this is basically the recipe for your experiment. The purpose here and our goal here is to provide enough information so that anyone else in the world who wants to redo my study can, right? What's the point of a recipe? The point, if you're going to bake a banana bread, right? What's the point of a recipe? It's so that other people can recreate that exact banana bread that you have baked. And a method section is no different. It is a recipe to your experiment. So that 50 years from now, if someone, halfway across the world wanted to do your experiment again, they could. And they could do it, within a very fine degree of accuracy in exactly the same way that you did your experiment. So method sections are split into 3 parts. They are split into participants, where we discuss who were the participants, how many of them were there, how did we get them, and what are they like? What is their age? What's their gender? What are there specific details about them that are important to our study? Such as, how long, maybe in this example about autism and aggression, how long have they been diagnosed with autism for? What is their specific diagnosis? Because we know autism is, for example, a spectrum disorder. Just relevant details about the participants. Our second section is where we discuss our apparatus and measures. Basically, what equipment did you use and how did you collect data, or what did you use to collect data, rather? So what are all the things that you used? What computer programs? What questionnaires? What building were you in? What time of day was it? Those sorts of physical information about the tools you use to collect data. And lastly, our third section is procedures. This is a description of the steps, right? People came into the lab at Georgia State University and were greeted by a research assistant. They've completed demographic information before entering the lab. They then sat down at the computer for 25 minutes to complete our measurements of aggression, right? Whatever. You're describing step by step by step by step the procedures of your experiment. And so when we put these 3 things together, we should know exactly who we're talking about, number 1, the tools we used to learn about these people, number 2, and then how we deployed those tools in a procedure, number 3. And that's the recipe for our experiment. So we want to think about the method section as having this first purpose, right? Provide the details so it's possible for other people to replicate your study. But then additionally, your method section with all of this information allows the reader and the world at large to judge the reliability and validity of your experiment. Like maybe you made a decision to use already existing autism diagnoses, right, for your study. So have you ever been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder? Yes or no, right? And so we're just using some other doctor's diagnosis who we don't know, versus giving our own assessment of autism behaviors and symptoms, and then being our own judge for whether someone qualifies as on the ASD spectrum or not. There's good and bad reasons to do it either way, but what this information allows the reader to do is to judge whether they think you did it appropriately or not, right? Maybe someone would have a problem with you just using pre-existing diagnoses because you don't know how all those other people are diagnosing autism. We hopefully think that they're doing it in the same way, but you can't be sure. Versus doing your own autism questionnaire assessment diagnosis. Maybe you're not a medical doctor, so are you qualified to do that yourself? Did you find someone who was qualified to do it? These are legitimate questions about reliability and validity of your experiment, and we enable the reader to ask those questions by including these details in the method. Our third section is results. This is probably the most difficult to read because It's just a bunch of statistics and tables and graphs and figures and numbers, and it can be difficult to get through. It's a lot of details. It's is potentially the most confusing part of a scientific paper because you know for all of the work that you've done in 3510 and 3530, you are not a statistical expert yet. There are lots of statistics that you're not familiar with, that you don't know exist. There are statistics that I run into in particular papers in very specific instances where I'm like, ooh, I need to go refresh my memory on that statistic. I don't quite remember exactly all the details that I need to about that one because there's just a lot of different statistics out there. Some of them are simple and some of them are very complicated and very specific. So this section can be difficult to read, but we want to do it because we need to be informed about exactly what these people did with their data. Important to note this final point down here. In a results section, we do not interpret the findings. We're not talking about what they mean or why the findings are important. We're just presenting the findings themselves and the data analytics plan. Our last section is the discussion section. This is where we take those results and interpret them. We talk about what they mean. In addition to talking about what they mean, we talk about what they teach us and how they maybe expand upon, support, or contradict the previous literature, right? Were we in line with all those previous studies that we talked about in the introduction? Or were we out of line with them? And why do we think that might have happened? We want to talk about our limitations. No study is perfect. There is no perfect experiment. And we want to be honest about that and discuss the potential limitations of our study and how that might maybe soften our conclusions, perhaps, or would cause our conclusions to maybe only apply to a particular set of people, something like that. We want to address alternative explanations for our findings. So how might we be wrong, right? Remember, science is a conservative process. We want to keep open the possibility that we are incorrect. We always leave that door open. That's what makes science different from ideology. Ideology says, I'm correct and I know I'm correct and it's impossible for me to be wrong. Whereas science says, this is what I think. This is what the data show me. This is the most rational conclusion, but there could be an alternative explanation. We always leave that door open. And lastly, what should we do in the future now that we have these new results, these new findings? Does this suggest future research questions? Does this suggest maybe application to a new population or a new demographic? Right? Where should we take this in the future? And lastly, you of course have your reference section, which provides the necessary information for your reader to look up any of the sources that you cited. One, they might be interested in those sources for their own reading and their own maybe idea development. Or two, maybe they think that you've misinterpreted previous research, and so they want to go check. They want to go double check so they can go read that paper from 15 years ago and see if you as the author misinterpreted something. Okay. So let's talk about now that we've established the sections and what each section does, let's talk about some tips for reading journal articles, because these things can be difficult. They are unlike anything else that you have ever read. They're very particular, very specific, and they can sometimes be difficult to get through. Or you read them and it's just so packed with information and so packed with details. You get to the end of it and you've forgotten all the relevant stuff, right? So what are some tips for reading these things? First, it can be tempting to skip those middle sections that are all about the tiny details, methods, and results, because they're probably the most difficult sections to understand. But you don't want to do this. It's tempting to, and it seems harmless. But if all you're doing is reading the intro and the discussion, then essentially you're just taking that author at their word for what they did and the way it turned out. And that's not good. That's not being a good consumer of science. A good consumer of science wants to be critical of what they're reading. And so, and if we want to critique this article and make sure it's doing everything it says it is and it's doing it correctly, then we need to be able to critique their methods and results, and know that their conclusions are appropriate given their methods and results. So don't skip those sections, first of all, but also don't feel bad if you have trouble understanding them. Stuff can be highly technical. I often have to stop in the middle of reading an article and go look up other pieces of information to help me understand the current article that I'm reading. So don't be discouraged if you have to do something like that. If you run into something that you've never heard of before, never seen before, it's highly technical, that's okay. That's the way they're meant to be. Just go take that extra step and learn the information that you need to learn, and you will be better for it twofold. And also, we just have to admit that not everyone is the greatest at communicating. Just because you're a scientist doesn't make you the best writer in the world. And so there are varying degrees of skill when it comes to writing these things. So let's just also keep that in mind. So again, don't be discouraged if you have some trouble. Okay. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to cut this recording sort of in half so that it's not too overly long and burdensome. And the next one we'll pick back up with a quick introduction to APA style and some relevant details, both for your own writing and for when you're reading journal articles. Thanks, everybody, and I will catch up with you in the next clip for APA style.